on this episode of the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast.
Recently, that's been just a question in my mind. What a Christian aesthetic of film might look like. Not just what types of stories that Christian filmmakers should tell. Is there anything in like the way that the story is told, the form, the filmmaking style that could be particularly Christian?
This is part 2 of my interview with Brett McCracken, senior editor of the Gospel Coalition, who oversees the content related to culture and the arts. Brett is a Wheaton College grad, and he has a degree from UCLA in cinema and media studies. In this episode, Brett and I talk about our shared love for the films of Terrence Malick and how his work demonstrates what Brett calls a sacred aesthetic. We will talk about what is a sacred aesthetic and how filmmakers can reach for this. Brett also provides some helpful advice for young filmmakers. This is episode 18. And I think you and I both have a great appreciation for Terrence Malick.
Yes.
Especially his film Tree of Life.
Yeah.
You can't package a film like that and get it sold unless you have a reputation like Malick.
Yeah, and I think that, Malick is kind of who I look to and I'll often cite as an example of someone who truly is like beating to his own drum, but it's a drum that comes from a deep well of deeply Christian outlook on life. And but you mentioned, and I think it's one of the big challenges is like in order to get where he's at now, where he can make a film like The Tree of Life, like he had to pay his dues in Hollywood with slightly more conventional films, Badlands, Days of Heaven, although even those were kind of radical for their time.
Yeah, they were quite radical. And in Badlands, it was just on his own. So he had nobody really.
Right.
So he had to get out and beat his own drum with his own financing and everything. Right. And that gave him the legs to move ahead.
It's true. Yeah, as much as Malick is a model and someone who I point young filmmakers to, I also want to give them the major like caveat that his is a unique story and a unique circumstance that probably won't be replicated again. But if you take just the broad idea of like someone who is both the story he's telling and the way that he's telling it has a Christian sensibility to it. Like that's what I love. That's what I would love to see more of is a style of filmmaking that is just feels like it's very Christian. It's very sacred. There's something that is almost like cathedral-esque when you sit down to watch a Terrence Malick film. Like it's almost like the cinematic equivalent of sitting inside Notre Dame Cathedral or something. Like, and that's what I'm just fascinated by, the question of if there's like a sacred aesthetic of architecture, for example, that can't help but inspire this reverence and this upward vertical gaze, then what would that look like in film? Could there be a style of film that accomplishes that is just leads the viewer to a place of humility and reverence before an awesome God? So Paul Schrader, he wrote a book that kind of started exploring this question in the 70s with the transcendental style in film, which was a hugely influential book for me. But yeah, I've
enjoyed the book.
Yeah,
Malick is his own voice, and what he brings is not only his depth of spirituality, but he's also got a craft that he's honed for a long time. So right. I think that is one of the things I think is missing in Christian films as well, and rightfully so. I mean, we have to praise these filmmakers for getting out and trying things and getting out there and doing something. It's better that they're doing it and doing it poorly than not doing it at all. But it takes time for that craftsmanship to develop in an artist so that he can find that voice and be able to take that truth that he has and put it in such a cinematic form that resonates with audiences.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to just a patience that is often lacking in. I find like the fervor of Christians and evangelicals is great, and there's a lot of passion there, but it's kind of this impatient passion, I find, where
Yeah.
like you have a lot of people who are like very excited at the prospect of going out and making the next Passion of the Christ or whatever, like
Yeah.
a really influential Christian movie. And yet they don't recognize that like you're saying, in order to do that, in order to make something that's truly influential, that's truly impactful in the culture, you kind of have to pay your dues and you have to study well and you have to hone your craft, and we don't really have the patience to do that.
Yeah.
And I think there's also a weird kind of skewing towards the young and youth
Yeah.
in Christian culture, where
True.
we kind of elevate people too soon, because we get excited about some young, preacher or some young talented writer or whatever. And I think that it's just so much better to kind of challenge young people to like take your time. Like you don't have to write that first book when you're 22. Like you don't have to like make your magnum opus film,
Yeah.
in your early 20s. Like live kind of below the radar for a while and just perfect your craft. And even if you have to like work as a waiter for a while or have three jobs, as long as you're continuing to improve your art and your craft, it'll pay off in the long run if you have that patience.
Also think there's a bit of a naivete around cinema in general because things are more accessible now when we've had
Yep,
these wonder kids come out,
yep,
ever since Spielberg and Lucas, did their thing. There's always been
right,
the sense that anybody can do this, and they've even said that in the future, because everything's going to be more accessible,
right,
anybody can do this. Well, that's like saying anybody can write a novel. That's great,
right,
but no, but not everybody does, and
right,
there's so many novels being produced that are just awful.
right.
The great ones do rise, but they're so few and far between.
Yeah.
And it's just a naivete on the craftsmanship
Mm,
that is required in good filmmaking. It takes time, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it
right,
doesn't come to everybody.
right. One thing that I respect about Malick is, at least in the early part of his career, he took so much time between his films. Like it's almost like with his early success with Badlands and Days of Heaven, he was still young. He was, I think, in his 20s when Badlands came out. So I would imagine he felt a little bit shocked at like, oh, all of a sudden I'm kind of the talk of the town in Hollywood with these early successes. But the worldly wisdom would have said, okay, build on that. Like that you got momentum, like you're a hot commodity, so keep churning out films. But what does he do instead? He disappears for 20 years and no one hears from him. And from 1978 until 1998, I think he doesn't make any films and takes time. And you know, I think that paid off when he returned with A Thin Red Line. It was this like, amazing kind of glorious, huge, epic scale movie. And so, yeah, I think having that discipline to know, like, even if you have early success, like, to take time to like, rather than feel like you have to follow it up immediately, but to take time to grow, um, as an artist, as a thinker, being
Yeah.
inspired by other things, is
Hmm.
important.
Now, you wrote an article called "The Christlike Gaze in Cinema."
Yeah, recently that's been just a question in my mind: what a Christian aesthetic of film might look like. Not just what types of stories that Christian filmmakers should tell, or defining quote Christian film based on the content, the subject matter, the story, but is there anything in like the way that the story is told, the form, the filmmaking style that could be particularly Christian? So I was thinking about architecture and music and how like there kind of are certain sacred forms of those genres. There's cathedrals are a distinctly Christian style of architecture. Um, you know, cantatas and certain like classical music styles are distinctly Christian in music, but you don't hear about that in like filmmaking necessarily, like a distinctly Christian way of making movies. So that was kind of the challenge I gave myself, was just start thinking about that. So the article, The Christlike Gaze in Film, was just kind of a beginning exercise for like, what would some aspects or what would some aesthetic trademarks be of a Christian aesthetic. So I talk about three of them, but um, I'm sure there's many more, and I'm sure it's something I'll return to again and again. But yeah, this was kind of a first attempt.
Yeah, and yeah, I think that's a very good thing for us to be thinking about as filmmakers is what does that Christ-like gaze do, and how we are looking at the world, and how we can convey that in a cinematic form in telling our stories, because we're really trying to embody Christian theology, in what we do.
Right. Yeah, and some people um, kind of balked at the phrase the Christ-like gaze, like, but I really do think art is about looking at things, right? It's about
Hmm.
seeing the world in a certain way, and the artist, if the artist is anything, it's the vocation of kind of looking at something in a new way, in a slightly different way, and pointing the viewers, the audience's gaze to look at that thing and see it in a new light. So
Hmm.
whether it's a painter who, you know, paints something mundane like a fruit bowl or a landscape that you wouldn't think twice about if you just walked past it, but something about the artist just, yeah, makes the thing come alive in a new way. So art is about seeing. It is about a way of looking
Hmm.
at the world. And so for Christian artists, I think that means that a question we have to ask, if to be a Christian is to be a Jesus follower, to become more like Christ in everything that we do, then how do we apply that to our art making? Well, we
Yeah.
should ask the question, the stereotypical question, what would Jesus do, right? Like
Yeah.
how does he see the world? So that in writing this article, I looked to scripture for just any instance I could find where it described how Jesus saw people, how he looked at people.
Hmm.
What was his posture when he was around people? And so I use that as a jumping off point to kind of think about, okay, well, what does it mean for us in terms of what should our posture be towards the world, and how do we
Right.
look at people? And yeah, so that was kind of the starting point for that article.
And as a filmmaker and even as a writer, I always start with the point of view. What
Yeah,
is the point of
yeah,
view of this story? What's the point of view of how I'm going to shoot this film? What's the point of view of a commercial if I'm doing a commercial?
yeah,
Because I find without a point of view, then you just become this generic convention
yeah.
that
Right,
everybody does, and
right,
you never arrive at any deeper meaning.
right.
You don't only arrive at a deep meaning when you have that point of view. It's so important.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the most interesting art is that which has a clear point of view, right? Where
Hmm.
you can see the person behind the canvas of the painting.
Hmm.
You can
Yeah.
see oh, that's a Van Gogh. I can tell by the way that
Right.
he is painting, the way he's looking at the world, that that's a Van Gogh. Same thing with Terrence Malick. Like, you can watch 10 minutes of any Terrence Malick film and know that it's a Terrence Malick film,
Yeah.
um, because he has a point of view. And so I love that. I love when artists and filmmakers like bring their personhood, their particular way of being in the world to the way that they look at the world. And so there's, in critical studies programs in grad school, like when I was at UCLA, you would talk a lot about the feminine gaze, like what does that
Yeah.
look like? There's different gazes, right? There's like
Hmm.
the LGBTQ gaze, like so I just kind of, yeah, took that term and flipped it a little bit to talk about the Christ-like gaze. What does a Christian way of seeing look like?
I think that's brilliant.
Thanks. Yeah, I just love writing about this, and maybe, who knows, maybe I'll write a book about it one day.
So, who are some of your favorite filmmakers other than Malick, um, and Agnes Varda?
Yeah, I love Richard Linklater. He's one of my favorites.
Hmm.
I love. I think he has a really unique kind of way of utilizing time in his movies, which the Russian filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky, he wrote a book about film called Sculpting in Time,
Yeah.
and he kind of describes very aptly, I think, he describes film making as sculpting in time. Like, and
Hmm.
I think that's a great image. It's like you picture like a sculptor just kind of chiseling away at a mound of clay, and that's their sculpting. A filmmaker is kind of working with a mound, so to speak, of time,
Yeah.
right? They film time unfolding. So you start in the editing room with perhaps hundreds of hours of footage. You have a lot of time to work with, and then you kind of piece it together, and you can go back and forth. You can stretch time. You can fast forward time. So any filmmaker that really leans into that capability of cinema to kind of manipulate time in interesting ways, I really love. So Richard Linklater does that really
Yeah.
well, I think.
Hmm.
And Tarkovsky himself, I think, does that. So I'm trying to think of other ones. I think Christopher Nolan also is a um, inspiring filmmaker for me, like because he just really tightly edits his films and does interesting things with time
Yeah.
in his films. Dunkirk is a fascinating example
Yeah. It is.
of the whole idea of sculpting in time, where he has these three, side by side plot lines. Each of them is like doing like taking place over a different uh, chunk of time. So it's like 1 week, 1 day, 1 hour, and yet they're all unfolding in 2.5 hours of time in terms of the viewer's experience. So
Hmm.
yeah, I just love that. There's something as a Christian that I think some people often experience the movies as kind of like a church-like experience. It's like a secular experience of the transcendent.
Hmm.
You sometimes hear the movie theater described as like the church for the masses.
Yeah.
And I think part of why is that there's something very existential about time, right?
Yeah.
When we're confronted with ephemerality and just kind of the reality that we are aging and that time is a thing, and we feel not at home in time. It's kind of this this painful reality that we're eternal beings in the realm of time. So there's something, I don't know, I just find movies that really lean into the aspects of time, I find them to be just really easy jumping off points for thinking about theology and spirituality.
Brett, thank you for taking the time to share with us your thoughts on Christian film, your passion for the arts, and thank you for serving the church in the way that you are at the Gospel Coalition, and not only providing us thoughtful analysis, but challenging Christian artists to step up our game and think more seriously about our craft. You can follow Brett's work at the Gospel Coalition and his Twitter feed. Links are provided in the show notes. Brett also has a website at brettmccracken.com. That's Brett with two T's and McCracken with two C's. I've also provided links to some of his articles that I've found very insightful. Since we're on the subject of Terrence Malick, one of my upcoming guests, a prolific author and theologian, has been so moved by Malick's film The Tree of Life that he wrote a book about it. And his name is Pete Leithart. In our next episode, my guest is Terry Linval, who delved into the depths of the Library of Congress to research the history of Christian filmmaking from its very beginnings in the silent film era. And he's written 2 books covering this early history. And guess what? He's going to tell us how the church went from embracing the cinema as an art form to turning against it. You don't want to miss this episode. Thank you for joining me on the Ministry of Motion Pictures podcast. You'll find show notes and more information about us at www.ministryofmotionpictures.org.
One What we do in life echoes in eternity.